We are at the hour here at Quilt N Learn. This is our second live event of the day. One more to come later on, but very much looking forward to hearing from these four amazing artists we have with us today. And over to Beth Ann.
Okay, thank you. In the panel this morning, I showed a crazy quilt made by my great grandmother, Angie. And this is Angie's daughter, Lesta, my grandmother, holding me and my sister. And this is about the time that she started teaching me how to sew and quilt. So this was taken around 1971. And I've got the pigtails, so you can tell. And there's a close up of the quilt that, oops, back one. The close-up of that pink quilt was the quilt that my grandmother made for me when she made the baby quilt for my sister. So again, as we talked about this morning, in my family, almost every major milestone in our life was made marked with a quilt. And it's not so much anymore. That's kind of not as common with my daughter's generation and the next generation, but when I was growing up, it was still a big thing. Okay, next. Thanks, Bea. Um, Now, for myself, after my youngest child was born in 1992, I was diagnosed with what became a series of debilitating chronic autoimmune disorders. And at the urging of Grandma Baldwin, who was one of those grandmas of the heart, if you've ever had somebody like that in your life, you're not a blood relation, but you love them so much, it's their family. So at the urging of Grandma Baldwin, I returned to quilt making for comfort, therapy, and as a way to leave something tangible for my children if I did not live to see them grow up. And that sounds really melodramatic, I know. But at the time, there was many nights when the doctors would call my husband and tell him to come to the hospital because they weren't sure I would live till morning. And I remember him sitting by my bed and saying, "You can't leave me with these babies," kind of a thing. So the quilts, that was the first thing I thought of because of growing up with these family quilts and wrapping up and feeling my grandmother's presence. I wanted to do that for my children. So now these fabrics are very 1992. I wouldn't pick the same thing now. But this is a close up of the quilt that I made for my youngest. Can you go ahead? And I grew up again making everything by hand, sewing and quilting and everything applique all by hand. But sewing and quilting became too difficult for me to do. So I had to learn how to use a sewing machine, not just for piecing, but for applique and quilting too. And this was a big emotional hurdle for me as well as a physical hurdle, but I often don't have sensation in my hands. So I had to learn how to do things without being able to feel everything. So again, this quilt was 1993, and it's the last one that I hand quilted. Okay. But the good news is those discoveries, that journey, learning how to do things by machine led to a whole new career. And one of the things that I had been drawn to was Celtic quilts because of my own family history, Scottish and Irish and English and Welsh and a little bit of all of that. Celtic designs had a lot of meaning for me, but it was all done by hand. And I knew that I couldn't do it by hand. And that's when Grandma Baldwin took me aside and said, just figure it out, figure it out. And eventually I did. And that led to a book deal with Martingale and Company. And my first book was Celtic Quilts, A New Look for Ancient Designs. And this is one of the patterns that's in that book. And I now use that central motif as my business logo. These are a few more quilts. The first two are patterns that I included in the book. And then the last one is a journal quilt that I made for myself that I thought you might enjoy seeing. Okay. And after all these years, and it's more than 30 years now, I'm still playing with Celtic designs. I find that I tend to work in series. So I'll work on Celtic quilts for a while, I'll do traditional quilts, I'll do improvisational quilts, but I always keep cycling back into different styles, but I always come back around. And these are some of my more recent Celtic style designs. These two small ones are both patterns that are available in my shop. Okay. I also enjoy finished edge invisible machine applique with traditional shapes. This is based on the classic orange peel shape, and that's a technique that I've taught many times. It's about time that I scheduled again, so I will be teaching it again soon. But when I do these classes, what I'm looking for is that same heirloom look that I used to be able to do when I did it by hand, but doing it completely by machine and completely finished edges. I don't have any raw edges in these quilts. It's not that there's anything wrong with that, it's just a different style. I also like to do finished edge invisible machine applique with non-traditional shapes and subjects. The larger one is a mandala quilt that I made for myself. And then I have a little landscape. The Create Your Own Quilted Landscapes is one of my popular classes that I've been teaching for a long time. Go ahead. I also love fully machine sewn versions of the cathedral windows. I first learned to do it by hand, but obviously that wasn't going to happen anymore. So I saw some different ways to do it online and then ended up tweaking it so that it was easier for me to do, and it got a little bit tidier results for me. And now it's also a class that I teach. Okay. I love the interplay of color and value. And so my second book, many years ago now, was on Bargello quilts. These are two. The first one, Star Kindler, was inspired by the night sky and the Hubble telescope kind of thing. And the second one is called Autumn Glow. And that was inspired by coming back from a trip from teaching up northern Michigan, which was just beautiful in the fall. So the sun was setting and you had that kind of a glow on the hills and the leaves were changing. And I came home and made this quilt that weekend. Okay. I also like to adapt classic patterns. The first one is an adaptation of a pineapple pattern, which is a version of a log cabin. And then the other one that's tilted on its side, those are very tiny logs. They finish just over a ½ inch wide. But it was, I know, it was my one and only venture into miniature quilts. But it was one of those times where, again, I needed to just do something. And I sat down and I had a pile of scraps. And like Lorraine, I don't throw my scraps away, I use them. And this was a good way to use those little tiny scraps and also to play with value and how that can create different designs. Okay. I also like to do simpler modern styles. And this is the Easy Pieces pattern, which is the quilt also behind me. And these are two of the smaller sizes. But I designed that because I teach a lot about color and value. And I wanted a way for people to play with color and value without having to worry about intricate piecing or anything difficult. I also like big prints. Like I love Tula and I love Cafe. And so these tiles of quilts are good for those large scale prints. Okay. I also specialize in walking foot quilting. When I first started quilting, of course, it was by hand. And when I learned how to machine quilt in the early 1990s, pretty much walking foot quilting was in the ditch. You know, you either free motion quilted or you quilted in the ditch with your walking foot. And during the big early year of the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic, I had caught COVID teaching in March, like there was no testing then or anything, and then long COVID, and was very, very sick for months. I wasn't mobile for about 7 months. And as I started to get back, I wanted to quilt again. And I realized that I didn't have enough strength in my arms to do the free motion that I wanted to do that I had been doing on my quilts. And so I started to explore quilting again, and edge to edge designs and designs that would be easier for me to do physically but would still get the looks that I want. And now it's one of my most popular classes, and I really enjoy doing it because there's so many things you can do with your walking foot, and it doesn't need to be difficult. And that's something that I really want to share with people because I know I'm not the only one. Every time I've taught or spoken to a group, I'm always amazed. There's so many people who are dealing with physical issues, emotional issues, other kinds of challenges that affect their work. And I want to encourage you to keep going, don't give up. And for me, sometimes I'm in a walker, sometimes I'm in a wheelchair, sometimes in an electric wheelchair. Sometimes I can't quilt at all. When I can, I go like a house of fire. My family cooks, my family cleans. They let me do my thing because it gives me so much joy. But I've also learned lots of different ways to do things that are easier. And so I encourage you, don't be discouraged because there are ways to make it easier. You want to go ahead to the next one? We're almost done. Free motion quilting. I still do love free motion quilting. Now, truth in advertising, I have free motion quilted on my little home machine. I don't have a quilting machine. On my little home machine, 110 inches wide quilt. So I know how to do it. I've done it. I know how to do it. Physically, I don't have the strength to handle that big a quilt in my machine anymore, but I still do love to do free motion quilt, but now I do it on smaller pieces. And I still teach it. And thread painting, which is why I'm in this event to share thread painting, because again, it is not so hard. There's lots of fudge room. It's very forgiving. And so I encourage you to give it a try and let me know how it goes. And I want to thank you for letting me share my quilts with you. And I hope to see you again someday.